History shows a pattern that has already destroyed three global superpowers in the last 500 years. In the late 1500s, Spain controlled over half of the world's gold and silver. Its currency dominated Europe. Its empire stretched across continents. Within 80 years, it was bankrupt and never recovered. In 1914, Britain ruled the largest empire in human history. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. Trade flowed through London. The sun never set on British territory. Within 40 years, the empire collapsed and Britain became a secondary power. In 1991, the Soviet Union, a nuclear superpower with global reach, ceased to exist in just 900 days. None of them fell because of invasion. They collapsed from internal economic failure. Three empires, three collapses, the same sequence every time. And here is the critical point. By 2025, the United States has already completed 5 of the 7 stages. We are not approaching the pattern. We are already inside it. If you want to understand what this stage has historically meant for currencies, assets, and why gold consistently reappears before the final phase, this channel documents those patterns using historical evidence rather than speculation. This is not a story about sudden chaos, because collapse does not begin with panic. It begins while life still feels normal. Before Spain defaulted on its debts, its silver coins still circulated, markets still opened, merchants still traded. From the outside, the empire looked intact. Before Britain lost its empire, the pound was still trusted. Ships still crossed the oceans, parliament still functioned. London remained the financial center of the world. Before the Soviet Union dissolved, it still possessed nuclear weapons. It still maintained troops across multiple regions. It still projected power far beyond its borders. In every case, the final collapse arrived only after a long period when nothing appeared wrong. People went to work. Banks opened in the morning. Stores sold goods. Governments made promises. That is why most people miss the moment that matters. They wait for visible disaster. History shows that disaster arrives last. What changes first is not daily life, but the rules underneath it. Not overnight, not announced loudly, but quietly, through adjustments that appear temporary at the time. A new policy, justified by stability, an emergency measure framed as protection, a technical change presented as administrative necessity. Individually, none of these shifts look like collapse. Together, they form the beginning of a sequence. This is where the pattern becomes dangerous, because the early stages do not feel like failure. They feel like management. In Spain, the empire expanded faster than its ability to sustain itself. Commitments multiplied across continents. Precious metals flowed in, but domestic production declined. The economy became dependent on what it imported rather than what it created. In Britain, global dominance survived long after the productive base weakened. Debt replaced growth. Prestige substituted for capacity. The currency retained its status, even as strain accumulated beneath it. In the Soviet Union, military power masked economic decay. Output continued, but value did not. Control replaced innovation. The system appeared stable, right up until it exhausted itself. In all 3 cases, the system did not collapse when pressure first appeared. It adapted, and that adaptation is often misunderstood. Later, it is described as failure. At the time, it was perceived as competence, the ability to impose order, to delay consequences, to preserve continuity. That is why the pattern repeats. By restricting options, systems reduce volatility. By narrowing exits, they prevent sudden outflows. By centralizing decisions, they gain time. But this time is not neutral. History shows that during this phase, power begins to shift quietly away from individuals and toward institutions, not through force, through process. Financial behavior that was once assumed becomes conditional. Ownership becomes less about possession and more about compliance. Liquidity becomes permission-based. Most people do not notice this shift as it happens. They focus on the surface, on routine, on the reassurance that nothing fundamental has changed. And on the surface, that is true. Currencies still circulate. Markets still function. Institutions still operate. But underneath, the framework has already adjusted. The purpose is not collapse. Not yet. The purpose is containment, to stabilize the system under pressure, to preserve continuity, to delay visible consequences. History shows that by the time collapse becomes obvious, the redistribution has already taken place. And this is why the present moment matters, because once a system reaches this stage, outcomes stop being debated and start being managed. In the next section, we will return to the first full expression of this sequence, Spain in the 16th century, and examine how decisions that seemed rational at the time quietly set the direction of everything that followed. Spain was the first full expression of this sequence at a global scale, and for that reason, it matters more than most people realize. Not because it was unique, but because it established the blueprint that later systems would repeat almost step by step. At the beginning of the 16th century, Spain did not look fragile. It looked unstoppable. After the conquest of the Americas, unprecedented quantities of silver flowed into the Spanish crown. By the middle of the century, Spain controlled the largest precious metal supply the world had ever seen. Its currency circulated across Europe. Its military power dominated land and sea. Its empire spanned continents. What followed did not resemble decline. It resembled expansion. Spain committed itself to defending and administering territory across Europe, the Americas, Asia, and the Mediterranean simultaneously. Wars multiplied, obligations expanded. The scale of empire grew faster than the capacity of the domestic economy to support it. This imbalance did not trigger immediate crisis because external inflows appeared to solve the problem. Silver paid for armies, silver paid for imports, silver paid for debt, but that reliance changed the structure of the economy. Domestic production declined because it no longer seemed necessary. Agriculture weakened, manufacturing stagnated, skilled labor moved elsewhere, wealth flowed through Spain rather than anchoring within it. The economy became dependent on imports paid for with external inflows rather than value created at home. As military costs rose and revenue proved insufficient, the crown turned to adjustment rather than contraction. Currency standards were altered. Coins retained their face value, but their composition changed. Debts were rolled forward rather than resolved. Defaults occurred, followed by restructuring, followed by renewed borrowing. Each step bought time. Each step preserved appearances. From the outside, Spain still looked powerful. Trade continued. Institutions functioned. The empire endured. But the productive base was eroding quietly underneath the surface. When inflows slowed and obligations remained fixed, the system lost flexibility. Exhaustion followed. Not collapse at first, but constraint. By the time Spain's decline became visible, the sequence was already complete. Britain followed the same structure centuries later, using different tools and a more advanced financial system. At its height, Britain controlled a quarter of the world's land surface and governed hundreds of millions of people. London was the center of global finance. The pound sterling functioned as the world's reserve currency. British institutions were regarded as permanent. Like Spain, Britain expanded beyond the capacity of its domestic economy to sustain empire indefinitely. Military commitments spanned continents. Trade routes required constant defense. Administrative obligations multiplied. As long as global confidence remained high, the system appeared stable. The turning point did not arrive with immediate collapse. It arrived with war. The First World War imposed costs that exceeded Britain's capacity to pay from internal resources. To sustain the conflict, Britain relied on borrowing, particularly from the United States. Reserves declined. Obligations increased. When the war ended, Britain emerged victorious, but financially constrained. Instead of adjusting commitments downward, the system attempted to restore pre-war conditions. Currency policy focused on defending appearances. The pound was maintained at levels that no longer reflected economic reality. Domestic strain increased as interest rates remained high to protect currency credibility. Industrial competitiveness suffered, employment declined. Again, these were not signs of collapse, they were signs of management. The Second World War intensified the imbalance. By the end of that conflict, Britain faced obligations that exceeded its productive capacity by a wide margin. Debt accumulated faster than growth. The empire became financially unsustainable. What followed was not sudden implosion. It was systematic retreat. Territories were relinquished. Commitments were reduced. The reserve currency role ended. Britain retained institutions, culture, and influence. But the structure had shifted permanently. The country transitioned from global hegemon to secondary power without a single decisive moment of collapse. In both Spain and Britain, the sequence followed the same logic. Expansion created obligations. External inflows masked imbalance. Adjustments preserved continuity. Exhaustion followed. Only then did visible decline appear. The important point is not how long the process took, it is how late recognition arrived. In each case, the system looked functional. Deep into the later stages, markets operated, currencies circulated, governments spoke confidently. What had changed was the framework underneath those signals. Flexibility was gone. Options were narrowed. Decisions were increasingly constrained by past commitments. This is why historical comparison matters. Spain and Britain did not collapse because they failed to see danger. They collapsed because by the time danger was visible, the sequence had already limited available responses. What remained was administration, not choice. The next case compresses this pattern into a far shorter time frame. The Soviet Union moved through the same structure not over centuries, but over decades, and its final phase arrived with a speed that few believed possible until it happened. That is where the sequence becomes impossible to ignore. In the next section, we will examine how the Soviet system advanced through these stages faster than any major power before it, and why its collapse offers the clearest view of how late-stage transitions actually unfold in real time. The Soviet Union presents the most compressed version of this sequence, and for that reason, it is often misunderstood. Many assume its collapse was sudden or ideological. In reality, it followed the same structural progression as Spain and Britain, but at a much faster pace. The shorter timeline makes the mechanics clearer, not different. After the Second World War, the Soviet Union emerged as one of two global superpowers. It possessed nuclear weapons, controlled Eastern Europe, and projected influence across multiple continents. Militarily, it matched the United States in scale. Politically, it positioned itself as an alternative global system. On the surface, it appeared durable. Beneath that surface, the imbalance was already forming. The Soviet system committed an extraordinary share of its resources to military power. Defense spending consumed a far larger portion of national output than in any comparable economy. This allocation was not temporary, it was structural. Maintaining parity with the United States required constant investment in weapons, personnel, and global presence. At the same time, the domestic economy failed to generate corresponding productivity. Central planning prioritized quotas over value. Factories operated, but efficiency declined. Innovation slowed. Consumer goods lagged far behind global standards. These weaknesses were not immediately destabilizing because external revenues masked them. Energy exports played the same role that silver played for Spain, and global finance played for Britain. Oil and gas revenues provided hard currency. They paid for imports. They supported foreign commitments. They covered inefficiencies within the system. As long as those revenues remained high, the imbalance appeared manageable. This dependence quietly altered incentives. Rather than reforming production, the system relied on control. Rather than encouraging innovation, it expanded administration. Economic performance became something to be managed rather than improved. Output continued, but adaptability declined. The currency reflected this reality. The ruble did not function as a trusted medium of exchange beyond Soviet borders. Even within the system, confidence was limited. Hard assets and foreign currencies were preferred when available. The state compensated by using external revenues to settle international obligations directly, bypassing its own currency where possible. As long as energy prices remained favorable, this structure held. When prices fell in the 1980s, the weakness became visible. Revenues declined. Reserves depleted. The system lost its primary buffer. Instead of reducing commitments, the response followed the familiar pattern. Controls increased, adjustments multiplied, rules governing prices, movement and access tightened. These measures preserved short-term stability, but further reduced flexibility. What made the Soviet case distinct was speed. Spain exhausted itself over decades, Britain over generations. The Soviet Union moved through the later stages within a single political lifetime. Once the external buffer failed, the system had little capacity to adapt. The productive base was too weak, confidence too thin, obligations too rigid. The loss of external control followed quickly. Eastern European states withdrew. Strategic depth disappeared. Maintaining influence became impossible without resources to support it. The empire contracted rapidly, not through invasion, but through withdrawal. By the late 1980s, the structure could no longer endure. Administrative control replaced economic function. Shortages became visible. Coordination failed. The system continued to operate formally, but it no longer solved the problems it was designed to manage. The final phase arrived without dramatic conflict. Institutions dissolved, authority fragmented, the military could not be funded reliably, the currency lost remaining credibility. In 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. From the fall of the Berlin Wall to dissolution, less than 3 years passed. What matters is not the political explanation, but the structural one. The Soviet Union did not collapse because it lacked power. It collapsed because power was no longer supported by capacity. The system had exhausted its buffers. This case matters because it shows how late-stage transitions actually unfold. They are not chaotic at first. They are administrative. They are justified as necessary. They feel temporary. Only later do their consequences become visible. By the time collapse appears obvious, the sequence is already complete. The Soviet example also removes a common illusion. Many believe that modern systems are too complex, too managed, or too technologically advanced to follow historical patterns. The Soviet Union was highly centralized, heavily monitored, and administratively sophisticated. That complexity did not prevent collapse. It accelerated it. The lesson is not ideological, it is structural. When obligations exceed productive capacity, systems respond by tightening control rather than reducing commitments. That response can preserve stability for a time. It cannot restore flexibility. Once flexibility is gone, outcomes narrow quickly. This is why the Soviet case is essential to understanding the present. It demonstrates how quickly late-stage transitions can unfold once buffers fail. It also shows that collapse does not require invasion, panic, or sudden disorder. It requires exhaustion. With Spain and Britain, the sequence unfolded slowly enough. The generations passed before recognition became widespread. With the Soviet Union, the compression made the pattern unmistakable. The remaining question is how this structure expresses itself in the current system. In the next section, we will examine how the United States aligns with these same stages, not as a prediction, but as a structural comparison, and where the sequence appears to be most advanced today. When the sequence is applied to the United States, the comparison is uncomfortable, not because it predicts an outcome, but because the structural alignment is difficult to dismiss. The stages do not require identical circumstances. They require similar relationships between obligations, capacity, and adjustment. On that basis, the United States aligns closely with the later phases of the same pattern. The first stage is overextension. The United States maintains military commitments across a global network unmatched in scale. Bases, alliances, security guarantees, and forward deployments span multiple regions simultaneously. This posture was sustainable when economic expansion consistently outpaced obligations. Over time, The cost of maintaining that reach increased while the margin for error narrowed. Overextension does not mean weakness. It means commitments exceed the system's ability to respond to multiple pressures at once without strain. What comes next in the sequence is not disorder. It is consolidation, not panic, but procedure. The surface may remain calm. The framework underneath continues to adjust. In the final section, we will examine how the sequence historically moves beyond this stage, why recognition usually arrives late, and what changes when systems shift from managing stability to managing distribution. As this sequence moves into its later phases, one pattern becomes consistent across history. Recognition arrives only after the structure has already shifted, not because people were unaware, but because the system did not appear to be changing in ways that demanded immediate reaction. In Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union, the final stages were never announced as endings. They were framed as adjustments, technical responses, necessary refinements meant to preserve stability. Daily life continued, institutions operated, authority remained intact. What changed was not the surface, but the framework beneath it. The way value was measured, accessed, and distributed began to shift. This is where historical analysis often becomes distorted. In hindsight, these moments are described as failure. In real time, they were experienced as management, measures designed to contain pressure rather than resolve imbalance. The system was no longer optimizing for expansion. It was optimizing for endurance. Endurance requires predictability. Predictability requires structure. Structure determines who absorbs cost and who retains position. Once systems reach this phase, the remaining stages do not unfold because of panic or sudden collapse. They unfold because flexibility has already been reduced. Earlier in the sequence, adjustment is optional. Later, it becomes compulsory. The system responds to constraint by narrowing behavior rather than widening opportunity. History shows that this transition changes the role of rules. What once existed as guidance becomes requirement. What once felt temporary becomes procedural. Definitions narrow. Exceptions disappear. Compliance replaces discretion. These shifts are rarely dramatic. That is why they are often missed. Currencies still circulate. Markets still function. Governments continue to communicate continuity. Yet, underneath, the operating logic has changed. Stability is no longer maintained primarily by trust. It is maintained by structure. This is also where misunderstanding becomes common. Observers argue that conditions are unique, that modern systems are more complex, more managed, more resilient. Similar arguments appeared in every historical case examined earlier. Spain believed access to global silver guaranteed permanence. Britain believed financial sophistication ensured durability. The Soviet Union believed centralized control provided immunity. Complexity did not prevent the sequence. It accelerated it. As systems become more interconnected, adjustments propagate faster. Dependencies deepen. Control mechanisms concentrate. Once obligations exceed capacity, systems do not reverse course. They complete the sequence because alternatives narrow. This does not mean collapse is inevitable at a specific moment. It means outcomes become constrained by structure rather than choice. Timing varies, expression differs, direction remains consistent. The most important implication is not fear, it is orientation. Understanding where a system sits within a recurring sequence changes how events are interpreted. A policy adjustment is no longer isolated. A technical refinement is no longer random. A valuation shift is no longer accidental. They align within a framework shaped by constraint. This perspective does not require agreement or prediction. It requires comparison. History shows that once systems transition from expansion to preservation, the most consequential changes occur quietly. By the time they become widely visible, redistribution has already begun. Access has already narrowed. Structure has already shifted. That is why early recognition matters, not to provoke urgency, but to remove surprise. When surprise is removed, events stop appearing chaotic. They become legible. Patterns replace speculation. Context replaces emotion. This channel exists for that purpose, not to forecast dates, not to assign blame, but to document how these sequences have operated repeatedly across history and how they tend to resolve once certain thresholds are crossed. If you see elements of this sequence reflected in the present, you are not alone. History shows that recognition typically spreads just before the final adjustments become visible. That timing is consistent across cases. To continue this analysis, leave a single word in the comments. Stage. It helps guide which historical mechanism we examine next. If this breakdown clarified how financial systems transition under pressure, consider subscribing. Future episodes will continue mapping these patterns using historical evidence rather than speculation. And if you want to follow directly from this point, watch the next video where we examine how reserve behavior and settlement practices have historically shifted during late-stage transitions and why those signals tend to appear before the final phase becomes visible. Before you go, consider this question. At what point does stability stop protecting a system and start constraining it? That question has appeared at the same stage in every historical case examined in this video. The answers differed by era. The structure did not. Understanding that distinction is not about predicting outcomes. It is about recognizing sequence. History does not repeat because people fail to learn. It repeats because systems under pressure respond in consistent ways. Once that becomes clear, the sequence becomes difficult to unsee. The second stage is currency distortion. This does not require visible breakdown. It begins when a currency's role shifts from reflecting productive capacity to facilitating obligation management. Over decades, monetary expansion increasingly compensated for structural imbalances. This process did not feel disruptive because it was gradual and administrative. The currency continued to circulate. Markets continued to function. The adjustment took place through policy mechanisms that prioritized stability and continuity. The third stage is debt dependence. Debt becomes structural when it no longer finances expansion, but sustains existing commitments. At this point, borrowing does not create additional capacity. It preserves current operations. Interest obligations grow faster than productive output. Fiscal flexibility narrows. This does not trigger immediate crisis because credibility remains high. It does, however, limit future options. The fourth stage is erosion of productive capacity. This is not the absence of innovation or activity. It is the relocation of production away from the domestic base. Over time, supply chains lengthened. Manufacturing concentration shifted outward. The system became more efficient in appearance and more fragile in structure. Dependence replaced redundancy. Output remained high, but control diminished. The fifth stage is social and institutional strain. This stage is often misunderstood as cultural or political. Structurally, it reflects declining alignment between obligations and resources. When systems can no longer expand to resolve tension, pressure expresses itself internally. Trust weakens. Coordination becomes harder. Institutions continue to function, but confidence in their ability to adapt declines. These stages do not appear simultaneously. They accumulate. Each one increases reliance on management rather than growth. Each one reduces flexibility. By the time the fifth stage is visible, the earlier stages are already embedded. What distinguishes this phase is not collapse, but normalization. The system continues to operate. Markets open. Currency circulates. Authority remains intact. The adjustments that define this stage are procedural rather than dramatic. Rules become more detailed, reporting expands, exceptions narrow. Behavior becomes more regulated, not through force, but through framework. This is where historical comparison becomes precise. In Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union, the fifth stage marked the transition from expansion logic to preservation logic. Growth was no longer the priority. Stability was. The system's objective shifted from creating capacity to managing imbalance. In that transition, assets begin to matter differently, not because of speculation or emotion, but because of institutional behavior. Systems preparing for constraint prioritize predictability. They favor instruments that can be tracked, categorized, and administered under stress. This shift does not require public acknowledgement. It occurs operationally. Historically, this is the stage where reserve behavior changes quietly. Settlement preferences adjust. Long-term obligations are reconsidered. Anchors outside discretionary creation regain relevance. These moves are not reactions to collapse. They are preparations for endurance. The critical point is that none of this requires intent to fail. The sequence advances because alternatives diminish. Reducing commitments becomes politically and administratively difficult. Preserving continuity becomes the least disruptive option. Adjustment replaces reform. At this stage, debates focus on surface indicators, growth rates, market performance, employment figures. These metrics can remain positive even as structural flexibility declines. That is why recognition lags reality. The system appears functional until it cannot adapt further. History shows that once the fifth stage is reached, the remaining stages are not chosen. They are conditioned. The question is no longer whether the system will change, but how that change will be administered. This is why the present moment matters, not because it signals immediate collapse, but because it defines the boundary between flexibility and constraint. Earlier in the sequence, multiple paths remain available. Later, options narrow quickly. Understanding this alignment does not require prediction. It requires comparison. When multiple independent systems across history respond to similar pressures in similar ways, coincidence becomes unlikely. The United States does not need to replicate Spain, Britain, or the Soviet Union to follow the same structure. It only needs to continue responding to imbalance through preservation rather than resolution.